Our next speaker, I don't see much, but I've known him for a very long time, and I consider him a good friend. 23 years ago, and 2 days back, John P. O'Neill Jr. came down to the World Trade Center to meet with his father. It was one of those things that when, you get past 40-something and, or up to my age, and you're trying to do something, your first go-to is, let me call my son. His dad needed him to help set up the computers in his office on his second day as the director of security for the World Trade Center. He had just left a long career in the FBI, where he was the senior executive in charge of the investigation into Osama bin Laden and Al-Qaeda. The next day, we would lose John in the collapse of the World Trade Center towers as he worked with others, police and fire, trying to organize the evacuation of tens of thousands of people before those towers fell. John P. O'Neill Jr. could have done a lot of things to put distance between himself and that trauma, but instead, he went into the private sector and basically focused on counterterrorism. At the Bank of America, in the IBM Red Cell, in their security division, he has been instrumental as part of that team in the adage that we all know is the pathway to the root of evil, which is follow the money. Now, all of this comes with rules and laws, subpoenas and search warrants, but I always found, dealing with JP, if you had an investigation and you came to him and said, this is what I think I need, you would always do better to say, John, if you were an investigator trying to answer the questions I'm trying to answer, is there anything else that I should be asking for? And then you would learn how the whole system works, and you would be a much better investigation because he knew it from the inside. He is still in the fight, still in the game, and when he's not doing that, he's doing important work as a victim's advocate. So please give us our warmest welcome for John P. O'Neill Jr.
So that was a great welcome. I am not going to be talking about myself today and what I've done, but I am going to be talking about my father. So to start off, I wanted to thank everybody in this room for everything that you do every day and your commitment to fight terrorism. I also wanted to take an opportunity to thank Ali Soufan for allowing me and inviting me to speak today. For those of you who don't know me, obviously John just explained who I was, but my father was known for his counterterrorism information and what he did as the for the chief of counterterrorism for the FBI. He was hired by the Bureau, and 8 days before September 11th attacks, he took a job as the head of security for the World Trade Center. On September 11th, 2001, the man who was a mentor, a friend, a boss, a confidant, a son, a father, and a grandfather was born to eternal life. I was in New York, as many of you probably were, on that fateful day that the towers were erased from the skyline. Several days before the attacks, my family was notified by Janet Reno that my father's body had been found. After hearing the news of his death, I became overwhelmed by the commonalities of grief that many of us know all too well. When asked to come and speak, I truly wondered what I could offer. As the audience, to provide an insight into the brilliant mind and character of the man who gave his life, as many others did in the fight against terrorism. I began to ponder on a singular question. I wished that I could ask him when he was alive, which was, after all that he had done in his life, what words would you use to describe your legacy? As his son, I will try to answer that question to the best of my ability. There are 3 adjectives that I think best describe my father. Dedicated. This theme was evident when I have had conversations with those who knew him. My father was dedicated. Many wondered if my father ever slept. I still to this day don't believe that he ever did, and one day decided to ask him why he never slept. His answer was short: I will sleep when terrorism ends. As his son, I admired his passion, his relentless pursuit of those who seek to do injustices unto others, and his grit. His dedication seeped into other areas of his life. He would meet with people regardless of the time of day, and his energy seemed to be contagious. He always said to me, son, you can accomplish more by smoking cigars and having drinks in one night than you could in 2 weeks during normal business hours. That is something of his that always struck me. Resolute. When it came to my father's work, he was unwavering and possessed a level of clarity that was nothing short of absolute. He knew himself and the task in which he had to accomplish, no matter what obstacles sat between him and his goals. He maintained his presence even in the face of adversity, which I believe probably came off as hard-headed and stubborn to most people. Shortly after 9/11, I received a video from the French filmmakers that were following FDNY Engine 9 Ladder 1 when the towers were hit. A portion of that video showed my father in the lobby of the North Tower. When I watched the video, he was calm when there was chaos and destruction around him, even in the face of knowing that those next few minutes might be his last. This is who he was to me. In the stressful situations that I had seen him in, on that day, it was no different, calm and confident as ever. Patriot. My father was a strong believer in protecting the United States from those who meant to do it harm. He proved this repeatedly with his actions. Being a patriot does not mean that you just protect the United States. It means that you protect all countries from terrorism because it has the best interest for those countries which impact us. He deeply defended the values, interests, culture, and diversity of our country. One aspect that my father believed wholeheartedly in was bringing justice to those who were impacted by terrorism. When it came to the victims of terrorism, my father wanted their families to have closure. To him, closure could only come in its one and purest form: justice. I have been told that my father was a hero for helping people on 9/11, and I agree wholeheartedly with them. But bear with me as I tell you a typical cliche on how my father was a hero long before anyone recognized him as such. When I was 11 years old, I was playing soccer on a small rec team near my house. My father was one of 3 coaches. A fast-moving storm came in and the game was stopped. And the head coach told all the players to go to their parents' car. One of the players was looking for their parents' cars when he was struck by a bolt of lightning. My dad and the other 2 coaches saw this happen. They went over to him and saw that he was not breathing. And the 3 of them performed CPR. After a minute, my teammate started breathing again. An ambulance took him to the hospital, and he was able to survive because of my father and those 2 coaches. My father's legacy lives on and flourishes in those people whose lives he touched through his dedication, his resolve, and in his commitment to do what he thought was right. His only wish, I believe, would be the continuance of justice being served to those who wish to do us harm, so that we protect the foundation of this great country, provide a safe environment for the generations of tomorrow. Dad, I hope this made you proud. Thank you.
So we're getting into our first panel today. I would like to introduce, let me make sure I'm in the right place, the Evolving Terrorism Landscape, Emerging Trends and Threats, Peter Bergen, we talked about him. Peter is a journalist, but he's more than a journalist. He's a thought leader, a renowned author, and as we mentioned, the first television journalist to find and interview Osama bin Laden. Deputy Commissioner Rebecca Weiner, Deputy Commissioner for Intelligence and Counterterrorism at the NYPD. She is the person who has her thumb on the pulse of terrorism and the key responsibility for the operations that protect this city against all the plots of the past, 62 that have been interrupted, stopped, or uncovered under her watch during her time, and all those that may come. Bobby Wells, Mr. Robert Wells, is the Executive Assistant Director for National Security at the FBI, but before that he was the Assistant Director in the Counterterrorism Division. This just means he moved up a step, but he also inherited a world of other threats that includes China, Russia, Iran, and so many others. So don't ask him what keeps him up at night. Brian Jenkins invented this discussion. We set our clock in the post-9/11 world, all it means, all we've done. Brian Jenkins has been thinking about this for 50 or 60 years and has been the leader in these discussions way before terrorism was front burner. And he is the senior advisor to the president of the RAND Corporation. And Mr. August Cole, he is the managing partner at Useful Fiction. Useful Fiction is the answer to what the 9/11 Commission said was the failure of imagination. It is a way to use fiction writing and fact-based thinking to raise the questions about what if this is what happens next. Let's welcome our panel.
Let me start with you. I mean, that was an interesting point that John Miller just made, that there were 62 different kinds of plots during your tenure that have been averted. So as you look at those 62 and also into the future, I mean, what are the things that you're most concerned about in New York City right now?
Well, first of all, thank you to Ali Soufan for having us today. I think each time that we come together... Thank you. It's the mute function, you'd think. Several decades into the technological revolution, we would know how to do it. But a huge thank you to Ali Soufan and to Soufan Group for hosting us. And as I look out at this audience, it does feel more and more, somebody, I will not name him, said this feels like a high school reunion as you walk in the door. But it actually is more like a grad school reunion or a ongoing professional continuing ed reunion. It's just wonderful. Or maybe even a family reunion. So 62 plots and incidents, some successful, some obviously thwarted, since 9/11. So not all during my tenure, although I'll happily take credit for any good stuff that compounds public safety here over the last 23 years. And we put this out on the anniversary, the 23rd anniversary, just as a continued reminder of the threat environment that we face. And I'll talk a little bit about the trajectory, but then also want to focus on some incredible work done by DOJ just over the last week, FBI, international partners, local law enforcement, that really encapsulates the diversity of the threat that we're facing. What's interesting about these 62, and don't get too wedded to numbers, but it is important, during the first 12 years of the post-9/11 timeframe here in New York, there were 21, and during the last 11 years, there were 41. So that shows you what we've been certainly experiencing and talking about at a national level and international level, which is an acceleration. And that is accompanying a change of tactics, and it's accompanying an ideological diversification, and that's something that we've looked carefully at in our New York City examples as well. A threat dominated by external, dominated by Al-Qaeda, and we've all been through this evolution so much together. We've experienced it in real time. But it is always important to stop and look back, and now dealing with all of these different threat vectors, all at the same time. So a couple examples over the last days that give you a sense, and then the look forward bit is a whole other chapter. So starting with yesterday, an addition of terrorism charges in the case of an individual who allegedly came into the New York City area, spent some time in Texas, with some links to Iran around lethal plotting. Really important threat vector that we're seeing targeting US officials, targeting dissidents in some cases, an interest in avenging our assassination of Qasem Soleimani 4 years ago. So Iranian aggression, lethal plotting, big deal. 2 days before, you had an unsealing of an indictment against 2 individuals who ran something called the Telegram Collective, accelerationist, white supremacist, and Soufan has done excellent writing on this constellation of characters and the footprint that they have had, an online transnational network that is based in encrypted platforms, suggesting targeting guidance, tactical guidance, radicalizing, recruiting, all of what we started to see with Inspire magazine way back in 2010, but in the white supremacist neo-Nazi context that's had real-life 3D effects on public safety. So an individual who said he was influenced by Telegram conducted an attack in Bratislava, killing a couple individuals at an LGBTQ bar. There was just a really interesting attack in Turkey involving neo-Nazi, white supremacist ideology on the part of the attacker, who again said in his manifesto some influence of Telegram, a disruption of a plot to carry out an attack on critical infrastructure, electrical grid, who also was interested in traveling overseas to join the fight in Russia, Ukraine. So the increasingly transnational, but also very domestic accelerationist threat. That was a couple days ago. And then on Friday, you had an individual, Canadian-based ISIS-inspired individual who was allegedly planning to come to Brooklyn to carry out a heinous attack on a synagogue. So all examples of disruptions that are done by the fantastic work of FBI, of international partners, of state and local partners working collectively to disrupt all sorts of different threat vectors. And ending with the ISIS-inspired, the target was a Brooklyn synagogue. The time frame, notable for us, certainly here, anniversary of October 7th, or potentially Yom Kippur. And that is a real indication and a good encapsulation of this October 7th effect, meaning that the attacks themselves, the regional war that has ensued, that is ongoing, have created a tectonic shift in our threat environment that's going to last for years and years, and unleashed, I think, a real tsunami of anti-Semitism, but also a lot more. I mean, you have regionally all these emboldened actors who have been increasingly aggressive, and we could talk, I'm sure, on this panel for hours about all of it. Houthis, Hezbollah, Iranian actions regionally. But here in New York, and that's our primary focus, what you see, which was not at all what I might have expected. I certainly expected cases like this Canadian incident of people who are ISIS-inspired, galvanized by, terrorist attacks, a big one on the board, not just October 7th, but think about Crocus City or think about Iran. What I did not expect to see, and we are seeing it, is outright support for Hamas, for PFLP, for PIJ, on the streets of our city in a non-criminal context, for the most part, expressions of support, waving flags, wearing headbands, but certainly concerning, and arguably some of that support is coming from people who probably were not aware of the group's existence prior to a year ago. So that has been unanticipated and presents a real concern. And it requires all of us not only to be doing all of the collective work that we've been doing for the last 20 years, but I know we have a future person here on our panel too, but to really be thinking hard and outside the box about what might come with all of this, because it is chaotic and it is action-packed.
Thank you. Bobby Wells, National Security Division covers a huge waterfront, but for the purposes of this discussion, obviously Iran, international terrorism, domestic terrorism fall under your bailiwick. The October 7th anniversary is coming up. Clearly it's been a very energizing moment for certain groups. So what is, I mean, if you're ranking your concerns, what are they?
Yeah, good question. You know, really, it changes every day, and I think as Rebecca said, I mean, the threats are elevated on multiple fronts at the exact same time, which I think is something new. I mean, we saw ebbs and flows of different events with international terrorism, domestic terrorism, state-sponsored. But I think as our director said multiple times recently, I've said it as well, all three are elevated at the exact same time. So the October 7th event, obviously it galvanized the international terrorism groups. We saw all the major groups, including Al-Qaeda and AQAP and Hezbollah, Iran, Al-Shabaab, et cetera, calling for attacks against the West and the United States at the exact same time, which has really galvanized these groups. We're concerned about how this threat is going to manifest over time. We've already seen it. We saw, you know, hundreds and hundreds of threats post-October 7th here in the United States, targeting the Jewish community and others. I would say, you know, the international terrorist groups, the Secretary mentioned it this morning, ISIS, although we have had success with ISIS, and they've been dispersed to different places in Africa and otherwise, they are still intent on carrying out attacks in the United States. And we did work jointly with DHS to disrupt a group of 8 Tajik nationals who were here and had ties to ISIS and ISIS-K. So that's a significant concern of mine on the international terrorism side, as well as the lone actors, as Rebecca mentioned, Pakistani national, 20-year-old in Canada, inspired by ISIS, you know, trying to come to the United States, to New York City, to carry out an attack. Obviously, the domestic terrorism threat, if you look back the last several years, racially motivated violent extremists have been the most deadly out of all terrorism groups, both international and domestic. We've seen more deaths in the United States at the hands of RIMVs than any other. We saw the horrific attack in Buffalo. We saw an horrific attack in Jacksonville. And we remain very concerned about racially motivated violent extremists. We have the new 764 movement that's growing and expanding throughout the world of, you know, satanic cults that combine that with, you know, sexual crimes against children, accelerationism, you name it, they're involved in it, causing harm to young girls, so we're very concerned there. And then the anti-government movement. We're still seeing threats. Every single day we have threats that come into our call center about threats to FBI agents or other government officials, political officials. And then, you know, finally, and I really want to hammer this home with the threat from Iran, the government of Iran, and Rebecca alluded to this, they are determined to carry out an assassination on U.S. soil in retaliation for the death of Soleimani, and they are not going to stop until they're successful. We've seen it multiple times. We've seen it attempts on a dissident's life here in New York City, a kidnapping plot on the same person here in New York City. We saw the assassination plot against John Bolton. They were trying to murder him here on U.S. soil. We also had the recent arrest of Asaf Merchant, who was affiliated with the Iranian government, Pakistani national, fortunately recruited one of our sources and 2 of our undercovers to carry out his assassination plot. But he was determined to kill former U.S. government officials on U.S. soil. So to say what concerns me the most, it's hard to say. It's all elevated at the exact same time. One day it's a plot, it's an ISIS plot that we're dealing with. The next day it's a significant RIMV case. The next day it's an HVE, and the next day it's an Iranian trying to carry out an assassination on U.S. soil. So I'm concerned across the board at all levels of terrorism right now.
Brian, you've just written this excellent report that's available in everybody's program about political violence around the election. And you say that in the report that, you know, not since 1968 have we had this sort of constellation of potential violence around an election. Now, obviously, the Democratic National Convention in Chicago, there were a lot of concerns. Not much really happened, probably because of good planning. But what are the main points in your report, and what are your main, importantly, recommendations about what can be done? Because admiring the problem is one thing, but sort of trying to solve it is another.
In terms of looking at violence during the elections, I mean, there are individuals who are always out there, motives uncertain, possibly including the individual that most recently attempted to kill former President Trump. There are, in addition to those individuals who in many cases are simply using the elections or political violence as a conveyor for their personal discontents and difficulties, there are individuals who are, of course, passionate, in some cases extreme, about who is going to win the elections. And then there's a third component of those who simply see the possibility of violence during the elections as a way to, this is accelerationism, a way to create greater chaos in the country. And all of this is being fueled, as the previous speakers have mentioned, both domestically, but also by a great deal of information operations coming from abroad. And so in one sense, the threat matrix, I said at one time, was beginning to resemble an abstract expressionist painting, you know, too many colors, too dynamic. But focusing on election violence or violence during the elections, I had the privilege of presiding over a series of workshops involving both former federal officials, but the majority of the people represented local law enforcement, both on both coasts and in some other jurisdictions. And one of the main conclusions was that there was concern that we would not necessarily, despite the best efforts of the FBI, and this is primarily their territory, in terms of intelligence, no one was confident that we could assume that we would have advance warning or intelligence about some kind of a threat. First of all, the environment in the United States has become generally more hostile. Intelligence, police intelligence, has become almost a toxic word, and there was increasing timidity about these kinds of operations. Second, given the nature of the threat, many of these, as I said, could be carried out by an individual, and unless he talks to other individuals about his plots or beats his chest on the internet, we may not necessarily know it until it happens. And so therefore we're going to be in a response mode as opposed to a preventive mode, although prevention is still extremely important. In terms of response, there was a concern among the law enforcement officials, and again, this is not a federal perspective, but a local law enforcement perspective, that police departments, and of course it's dangerous to generalize about the 17,000 police jurisdictions in the country, but that in many cases police departments were concerned that they were shorthanded. Their counts in terms of filling the ranks were down. They were having difficulty recruiting. It wasn't simply a matter of the number of people in the department. It was because of recent events, post-pandemic, the defund the police movement, that a significant portion of senior, experienced people had retired, had left, and that's not easily, that has to be built internally. That's not something you go out and just recruit additional people, and that they had lost that, and that their budgets were constrained, and this prevented some of the exercises, some of the training programs that they wanted to do. And given that, in terms of their preparedness, and the atmosphere in the country, which can be described as flammable, I mean, just given the degree of political polarization, given the fact that bellicose rhetoric has become normalized, that it is increasingly common to hear political leadership making statements that promote or justify violence. We've completely lost any kind of comity in political discourse, that a single event, even something that began as a low-level event, or a small number of near-simultaneous events, as one inspires the other through social media, could spiral into a national crisis. And that, in a sense, like wildfires in California where I live, that a small fire just sends out embers and suddenly the whole landscape is burning. And that was the primary concern. Now, the federal government has done a great deal, as Secretary Mayorkas was describing earlier on, as the FBI has done. But the fact is, elections are run by the states. And the purpose of the report that you have in your folders was to really focus on the state-level leadership, the governors, the secretaries of state, the Homeland Security advisors, the fusion centers, the adjutant generals of the National Guard, that they really have to, in a sense, get together, and we recommended the creation of some ad hoc, purpose-built state mechanisms. I'm not talking about elaborate structures, but just task forces that can be quickly put together, tiger teams, if you will, to at least educate the people who will be making the decisions. For example, one of the common things that we heard was that political leadership at the local level does not have a profound understanding of the time it takes to deploy police forces in public disturbances. That they haven't, there's a tendency to defer decisions, to wait too long, and then to finally say, okay, call in the police, do what you have to do. By that time, the situation is extremely difficult. This is not something that, this is not simply a 9/11 call that gets people. So we recommended that. We recommended that the states create, again, a purpose-built, temporary, election-focused fusion center to bring together the information, all local information, threat-related information, everything that's coming down from the federal government, and everything that is coming from neighboring jurisdictions, neighboring states, and keeps the top officials aware of what's taking place, as well as the local officials at the local jurisdiction. So that was another one of the recommendations. And finally, we have to recognize that this is not simply a police matter. I mean, this is a national concern. It's up to all of us. I mean, if we as Americans cannot, whatever one's political preferences are, if we as Americans cannot agree that elections, the most fundamental right in our democracy, should be conducted without violence, then there's not a hell of a lot that the police can do.
August, your most recent novel, Bergen, is a sort of dystopian novel of the future that involves terrorism. What are you, and it based, and they're not novels in the conventional sense, in the sense that they're very heavily sort of fact-based, and you have sort of footnotes, etc. So what do you, the failure of imagination has already been discussed, and you can have a failure of imagination, but you can also over-imagine possibilities. So for instance, we went to war on the idea that Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction, turned out to be a fantasy. So what are your concerns, realistic concerns, about sort of the next phase of terrorism?
I like to say I'm an optimist who stares into the abyss, but after my panelists have just spoken here, I'm kind of wrestling with my belief set. You raise an interesting point, Peter, when we think about the future, it is, and I'm a science fiction fan, easy to follow kind of narratives that are almost fantastical. Surely, shaped by the things that we know, because great sci-fi is, in many cases, a reflection of the present or even the past. But when we're really thinking practically, in a government context, in a law enforcement context, defense, et cetera, being able to root predictions of the future in fact is really important, particularly when they're stories, right? Story is such an effective tool for communicating with people across organizations, to leadership, to the formations, in any kind of a department. And the idea that you're going to propose something to someone that's fantastical, or maybe isn't even something they're considering as a threat, to do so, you need to really anchor that in some sort of reality so they'll trust you. When I think about the things that really concern me or keep me up at night, the area that I often really want to explore more is the intersection of ideology and technology. Because we're at this moment where when you look at many of the most destructive ideologies, domestically, internationally, they are interwoven with the use of new communications tools, new means of attack, whether they're cyber. We'll see more drones certainly in the future. And I think that's a thread that's really important to explore because it often confounds the conventional ways of trying to understand what's next. Foresight activities happen across the national security community, across the law enforcement community, and they're often very siloed or very specific to a particular area of expertise or an operational problem. And the reality is the world is really messy, right? We live in it, we make it messy. And I think the challenge is finding a way, a means, to be able to connect to people almost at an emotional level, which is something I think we all understand why it's important, but yet engaging that critical and analytical part of the brain that gets someone then to ask the question, what do I do next? When we're working on a project, whether it's Bergen or even our book Ghostly about war with China from 2015, we're often thinking, what do I want someone to do next, right? I want them to understand, that's critical, but I also think about action. And that's not often the outcome that a writer is thinking about. But to me, when we're considering the next generation of threats, like again, this braiding together of ideology and technology, that is something that I think is hard to actually implement. It's difficult for government to do sometimes because it is unorthodox. But once tried, usually it's repeatable. Back to the kind of question of the threats, though, if I were to kind of articulate it in a really simple sentence, the thing that keeps me up at night in this kind of context of ideology and technology is like the weaponization of my children, right? We are now at a moment, and I see AI as central to future terrorism threats in different facets, from connection at almost a neurological level, at scale, but individually, right? What many of us who are looking at this in the defense context would call cognitive warfare. Well, those tactics and techniques are being appropriated and used, or maybe even developed more efficiently, by non-state groups and terrorist groups and political violent groups. The other aspect of this that I think is really important in trying to understand how this affects each of us is that we are often unable to counter that. When you look at the way we engage with our social media, and I don't mean to sound like a Luddite, and Ludditism is very much at the center of my second book, and I suppose there's some of that that's strong within me. But as individuals, we really struggle to kind of counter that. Try to get your kid off Snapchat, right? Try to get them to turn off SnapMap. It's not going to happen, right? There's no way. Those are very powerful tools, and that's a representative example, not an actual one, for how the sorts of groups that we're all concerned about here are shaping our behavior in the real world. As was mentioned earlier, in the introduction, the idea of finding targets that are unprotected, that are unexpected, and don't need to be high profile, because the ambitions and manifestations of some of these violent ideologies don't require that. So the cost, the asymmetry of action is even lower than it was 23 years ago in many cases. It might even be just code. So, not to be too dystopian, but that sort of unchecked opportunism is the world we're living in right now. There's another, aspect to this around biological terrorism. We just went through a pandemic, we understand that. But that is, I think, more complex to execute than we've kind of seen. And I think our awareness of that vector is probably more advanced. But if I were to say, again, the intersectionality of technology and ideology and the centrality of AI, those are probably the two things that I really think about a lot, because they impact every single one of us every single day.
Obviously, there is a difference between domestic terrorism and international terrorism, Rebecca, but it seems that the boundaries are more and more fuzzy. The Buffalo terrorist attack that the Secretary referred to influenced the Slovenia attack later, and obviously the Christchurch Manifesto has sort of influenced a bunch of terrorists. So, and then relatedly, you have this sort of strange, people who are sort of incel terrorists who maybe become right-wing terrorists, and the sort of people who start with misogyny and then sort of migrate into far-right terrorism, and there's a lot of blurring of boundaries, it seems. So what does that mean from a law enforcement perspective?
So I will answer that question, but I want to go back to what you're describing, because I'm so glad this panel has brought us together. I think it's really important, and Bobby mentioned this group 764, which involves children who are incredibly sadistically influencing one another, all online in the digital world, to commit horrific acts of violence to themselves, up to and including suicide, to their pets, to friends and family members, and committing acts that would not be nearly so easy to convince people to do in the offline environment. So this is a group and it's a threat that is absolutely integrally intertwined with the technological sphere. And the younger and younger threat actors that we're all grappling with is, again, 100%, not 100%, but very much influenced by the digital modality that people are radicalizing on, and neurologically what's happening to young people as they're engaging so much with really violent content that they're not actually able to incorporate, then plays out in the threat space. And we just had a school shooting a week and a half ago in Georgia, horrible, and first of this school year. Certainly has already been proved not to be the last school threats. We at the NYPD deal with hundreds of school threats every year. So the issue of children and technology has always obviously been a big part of, certainly warfare and terrorism, but there is something different that's happening with people engaging in their use of social media. So I think that's a really important conversation, and it's going to have to be dealt with in a public health context. But it is also enabling these very blurry, porous boundaries between ideologies that are encouraging people to commit acts of violence. And I think it means a couple of things. One is that often the violence is the point. It's not necessarily strictly the ideology. The ideology is a justification for rather than catalyst of, in many cases, especially among our young people. So it's not terribly surprising, and the different strains of ideology are quite widely available if where you're getting your information is online. And also the way that the white supremacist accelerationist ecosystem works is that there aren't formal groups like ISIS has with command and control and territory and governance structures in the same way. So replicating that structure is this transnational group, and that's why you have a meme culture that's shared and a language that's shared, and this sanctification of former assailants, and this influence and this playbook of writing your manifesto and invoking the same kind of conspiracy theory tropes like the Great Replacement, which, obviously the Secretary mentioned the Buffalo shooting, and hearkening back to Christchurch. That's replicating a structure that doesn't exist in the formal 3D world. And so it's important to create a sense of coherence online for these groups. So we'll continue to see those echoes throughout the world. What it requires of us is collaboration, right? We all have to be working together. And in some unusual ways, and that's another lesson that we've learned over the last 23 years, is it's not just about federal officials working with state and local. We have so many people in this audience today. We have from our Bureau of NYPD who are assigned to JTTF, NYPD who do this in our Intel division, NYPD who work in our Counterterrorism division. So that vertical sharing we've gotten really good at. There's also the horizontal sharing, but it's also requiring us to think about other partners outside of the realm of law enforcement and intel, private sector. Intelligence collection is not a monopoly of government anymore. It just isn't, and that's also because so much intelligence exists in the digital sphere. So it is probably just as easy to get good intel from photos that are available online, certainly open source, but beyond that, of private sector entities who are well positioned to understand a threat and help government in a way that was never necessarily the case. So we are all in this partnership piece together. We've worked really heavily to create networks. We have NYPD Shield, which has 20,000 partners around the world, Sentry, which is local law enforcement to local law enforcement across the country, to make sure that if it's Bratislava, or if it's Buffalo, or if it's Houston, or if it's New York City, we know who to call.
Without commenting on a case which is going on right now, which is the pendulum seems to have swung very much against the social media companies in lots of different ways. Australia, for instance, I think is you're not going to be able to get on social media until 16. Canada is contemplating some of this. The founder of Telegram was arrested in Paris. And I saw Rebecca nodding her head rather vigorously when August used the phrase, the weaponization of children, which I think is a very powerful. And if you look, let's just take one specific case that is outside your jurisdiction, sir, which is the case in Germany which was rather advanced about trying to kill a lot of people outside a Taylor Swift concert. It was a bunch of teenagers, and they all identified with ISIS. And none of them been to Iraq or Syria, as far as I know. They radicalized online. I mean, it's a big problem, but what can be done about it?
You're absolutely right. It's a huge problem. I think, social media, we have seen the evolution since 9/11. That's probably the biggest challenge that we've faced, along with encryption. And I think, that's why we focus very heavily in the FBI on trying to recruit sources in that online space. A large majority of these cases that we identify throughout the world are because we have people who have the ability to collect on these extremist Telegram channels, for example. But I think, encryption, and when we engage with Congress, we bring this up a lot, but it is a massive challenge for law enforcement across the board, not just in terrorism, but every other threat that we have, crimes against children, et cetera. The fact that we don't have the ability to get into an iPhone, for example, or there are certain platforms that we cannot access because of encryption. And if we don't have sources into those platforms, these plots are being planned and we have no idea. So that's a huge challenge, you're right. A lot of these plots that we see throughout the world, it's young people. I think that's the other massive challenge that we have, these impressionable young teenagers who are online talking to each other, motivating each other, inspiring each other to carry out attacks. And in some cases, we don't have access to that information. And thankfully, we have good intelligence throughout the world, and all of our partners were sharing back and forth, within the United States, but also our foreign partners, and we have to continue to do that. I think, to your question, how can we deal with this? That's a big part of it. It's partnerships, information sharing, it's engagements with the social media companies and trying to educate them on threats, and we do engage, if there is a threat to life, there is regular engagement with the social media companies. But it's also looking forward trying to find some sort of legislation. And when we meet with Congress, we encourage that. Something has to be done to help us combat this issue with encryption.
You know, another powerful source is social pressure. I mean, legislation is one thing, but I mean, if it's just, you know, if there's more power, I mean, you know, I rarely agree with Senator Josh Hawley, for instance, but, you know, he's been at the forefront of sort of, you know, saying that there needs to be more, you know, sort of, you know, if you're 14 or 15, there should be an ability for you not to get on. You know, as August says, maybe the kids will find a workaround, but at least, you know, there should be barriers to entry. And it's legislation one thing, but I think social pressure is another. After all, these companies make a lot of money.
But they do it through algorithms that depend on engagement. So we're all enslaved to these algorithms.
Yeah.
And so they have to change their business model, I think.
Right.
What I would just quickly interject too is, you know, the hyper-targeting of algorithms today. YouTube is a great example of being a really effective rabbit hole avenue for, you know, young people, for taking them places you probably wouldn't want them to go. We are going to be in a more immersive technology era in 5 to 10, maybe 15 years. So we can have a conversation about how do we police Instagram, or you know, we don't have to talk about Facebook maybe in the same way anymore, but we're going to have kind of the XR, AR, VR world that's going to be democratized and commercialized globally, allowing a different kind of more personalized connection to. And many of these things I think actually may be exacerbated because you're overlaying AI technologies on top of that. That just like today, you can use a large language model and, you know, write a first chapter of a novel. It won't be very good, but you can do it. You can also generate images. Well, those same technologies are going to be applied to virtual environments, right? So you can almost see kind of a radicalization engine potentially, and not to be, again, too dystopian, emerging out of this combination of technologies that some groups certainly will use for indoctrination and possibly operations.
You know, this has been quite a sober discussion. But I think it might be worth zooming out a bit. I mean, we're around the corner from the World Trade Center. And, you know, there hasn't been a major terrorist attack in the United States since 9/11. There was the Pulse nightclub attack, 49 people were killed by an ISIS sort of wannabe. You know, if we'd had this conversation a year after 9/11, I doubt that the consensus view would have been that 23 years later, the United States wouldn't have seen a major jihadist terrorist attack on its soil. So Brian Jenkins, since you've been studying this since for a long time, why is that the case?
Why is the case that I want to make sure I understand the question.
Why is it the case? I mean, go back to 2002. I mean,
right.
There was the idea that, you know, there was going to be a second wave of attacks. The terrorists would be armed with weapons of mass destruction. There was a lot of concern about, but it didn't happen for a variety of reasons. Why do you think what are those reasons?
There are a number of reasons. First of all, look, there is a lot of criticism of what is now, in retrospect, as the immediate threat atmosphere that existed post 9/11 has faded into history, but a lot of things were done. Some of them were egregious errors, should not have been done, strategic mistakes, abuses. Some of them were things that were that did work. It was sort of one of these situations. This unprecedented event happened. Which button you press? Do you press? And the answer is you press them all. That's the way I deal with problems on my TV set. You know, it's not working. Press all the buttons until something happens, and then I call my granddaughter. But the point is that extraordinary measures were taken immediately after, in terms of intelligence operations, in terms of diplomacy, in terms of law enforcement in this city, in terms of military operations. And undoubtedly, these had an effect. And in a sense, Al-Qaeda provided some assistance, because if you look at the string of attacks that did take place immediately after 9/11, there were attacks in Tunisia, Indonesia, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Morocco, in a lot of countries that might have preferred to be wallpaper as this battle took place between the United States and Al-Qaeda, that when those actions took place in their capitals, that made it a matter of personal survival. And one of the features of post-9/11 intelligence was that the global network of cooperation and counterterrorism went far beyond the traditional allies. I mean, unlikely partners were feeding each other information. Now, the construction of that was a major achievement. It requires continued nurturing, if you will. And one of the concerns is that, again, as memories fade, as people go off to preferred other subjects they prefer, that will, in a sense, atrophy. So that's one concern. The other, reason it did not happen is in terms of efforts to instigate further actions in this country. While Al-Qaeda and later Islamic State were able to do some things, the fact is that these ideologies simply did not gain much traction among the target communities. And not because of pressure from the federal government, simply because these were regarded even in the target communities as crazy ideologies. This is nonsense. So in that sense, the American system, in terms of its ability to bring in people and acculturate people and demonstrate tolerance, that didn't work. Now, and therefore we saw a fundamental change in recruiting. And that is, Al-Qaeda backed away from large, centrally directed, ambitious operations into remote recruiting by exhortation. And so the next generation, and that's what we're seeing now, are individuals who are indirectly inspired to carry out attacks. They are self-selectors. As I mentioned before, in many cases, they see the ideology as a conveyor for their personal discontents, and so we have combinations now. Terrorism, in a sense, has been atomized, if you will, down to individual decisions. And I think that's a trend that we are going to continue to see worldwide, and even get more serious because of the issues you were pointing out, the global influence operations.
I can also add, obviously, the people on this stage have played a key role in keeping us safe, and many of the people in the audience as well. Since we're at time, I'd like to thank Rebecca, Bobby, Brian, and August.